Okay, well, our theme this year is we've been making the case that Jesus is God, and this has been our main argument. We've been making the case primarily from Jesus' miracles, right? Now, most of the evidence for Jesus' miracles comes from the New Testament. This raises the question, though, is the New Testament historically reliable? So we've been spending the last few months trying to make that case, trying to give good reasons and evidence to believe that the New Testament is historically reliable. Now remember our goal in all of this, right? This isn't just an academic experiment for us, right? This isn't just an academic exercise. Our goal is we want to encourage people to put their trust in Jesus Christ as their Savior. That's why we do this work in apologetics. But imagine there's a group, let's say, that you're trying to encourage to trust in Christ, but this particular group that you're trying to encourage to put their trust in Christ doesn't believe, they're actually convinced that most of the New Testament is not historically reliable. So again, imagine the scenario. There's a group of people, you're trying to encourage them to trust in Christ, but they're convinced that the New Testament is not, for the most part, historically reliable. I kind of think of it like this. We use a lot of analogies in Rosh Christi to kind of help us get our mind around what we're discussing. So imagine this other hypothetical scenario. Imagine that you're a lawyer arguing before a jury that somebody is guilty of murder, let's say. Okay, so you're a lawyer and you're arguing before this jury that, let's say, Mike over here is guilty of murder. You're convinced of that and you're trying to make the case that Mike, in fact, is the murderer. Let's also say that you have very strong DNA evidence, but the group of people that you're trying to convince that Mike is the murderer thinks DNA evidence isn't very reliable. This jury, let's say, for whatever reason, thinks the DNA evidence isn't very reliable. So it seems in that situation, you would have two options. You could make the case that no, DNA evidence is reliable. You could pound that home and try to convince the jury that DNA evidence is good, reliable evidence. Or, alternatively, because this jury is so opposed to DNA evidence, you could build your case with other evidence only and just avoid the DNA issue completely. In other words, build your case on evidence that you know the jury is going to find more convincing, that they're more willing to consider. That actually might be a good strategy, especially if your other evidence is strong. It might be just a strategic move that you choose to do as the attorney in that situation. Now, this doesn't mean that you think that DNA evidence is bad evidence. No, you yourself might think the DNA evidence is very strong. But because you're trying to convince this jury that Mike is the murderer, since they don't think DNA evidence is reliable, you might not want to use that in your strategic argument. Similarly, now we can apply this analogy back to what we're doing with Jesus' miracles. Just to give you an example here. So I believe that the New Testament is historically reliable. I think we can make a good case for that, right? And that's what we've tried to do mostly this year. And if the New Testament is historically reliable, then everything it says, right, is historically reliable. It says that Jesus did miracles, and then we could conclude Jesus did miracles. But let's say, again, that there's a group I'm trying to encourage to trust in Christ, but they're convinced that the New Testament, for the most part, isn't historically reliable. It seems to me that the similar two options we would have before us, right? We could work on it. We could just try to convince them that the New Testament is, for the most part, historically reliable. Or, alternatively, we could try to build a case for maybe, let's say, Jesus' main miracle, the resurrection. We could maybe build a case for that with evidence that they would be more open to consider. Similarly, again, this might just be a good strategic move to bypass the overall historical reliability of the New Testament and just use those sections of the New Testament that all historians agree are historically reliable, and use them to make the case merely for Jesus' primary miracle, his resurrection. Well, some people have taken that second option, and of course, you might be familiar, the second option is referred to as the minimal facts approach. And those who utilize this minimal facts approach focus on Jesus' resurrection because that is his key miracle, right? I mean, even Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15 that all of Christianity rises or falls based on Jesus' resurrection. In fact, Paul says there in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Jesus' resurrection is false, our faith is worthless. And so the minimal facts approach focuses on Jesus' resurrection. And we see throughout the New Testament that is usually the key evidence that is provided as proof that Christianity is true. You can see this in Acts chapter 1, Acts 17, where Paul is talking with the Greek philosophers in Athens. They usually point to Jesus' resurrection as their primary evidence. Now, in terms of this minimal facts approach, probably the most well-known person who utilizes this approach is Gary Habermas. So let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Habermas. Now, he grew up in a Christian environment, home, church, but was skeptical of Christianity for many years. He explored many other religions, almost became a Buddhist, as he tells his life story. But he came utterly fascinated with looking into the historical evidence for Jesus. This led him down an academic path such that he got his PhD from Michigan State University, where he studied the critical historical method used by professional historians. And we've explored that method a lot using the work by Bart Ehrman to kind of understand how professional historians go about their work as scholars. Now, jump forward to today, and Habermas is so convinced by the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection that it's really what he's most well known for, is working in this area and providing what he believes is very good, strong evidence for Jesus' resurrection. But he's well known for this minimal facts approach. Here's a short quote from Habermas where he explains his approach. He says, "A case for the resurrection can be built by using only those minimal facts that are clearly established by the historical method. These facts can refute the alternative hypothesis and provide the best evidences for Jesus' resurrection." So when somebody utilizes this approach, and the way especially that Gary lays it out, they only use facts which pass these two tests, okay? So they're only going to use historical information that is extremely well evidenced and is affirmed by virtually all scholars who work in this field, whether they're Christian or non-Christian scholars, so even critical, skeptical scholars. Only those facts which are affirmed by such scholars and that are extremely well evidenced are acceptable to be used in this approach. That's why they're called minimal facts. Now let's just run through, if you see Habermas's presentations or read some of his books, sometimes he'll order the facts differently. But I've done, based on one of his books, I've laid out from one of his sources how he lays out 10 minimal facts as follows. So I'm just going to run through those with you real quick so you can kind of get a feel for what these minimal facts are that he uses in his approach. So these are the minimal facts then that are very well evidenced and affirmed by all scholars. The first one is that Jesus died by crucifixion, and you'll see a lot of this stuff that Ehrman also affirmed is accepted by all scholars. The second minimal fact is that Jesus was buried. Number 3, initially, Jesus' disciples were in despair after Jesus died. The fourth one is that Jesus' tomb was found empty, but he notes here only approximately 3/4 of scholars will affirm this. So, for instance, Ehrman used to affirm this, but he's moved, based on his study, he's moved where he doesn't think there's as much good evidence for this as he used to. So Ehrman himself wouldn't affirm this. Number 5, all scholars affirm that the disciples had experience that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Now, noted how that's carefully worded, because this is something that's even affirmed by non-Christian scholars. Obviously, if they're not Christians, they don't think that Jesus actually rose from the dead. But they do affirm that the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And we saw Ehrman affirm that as well. Number 6, the disciples were transformed such that they were willing to die, suffer and die for their beliefs in Jesus. Number 7, the resurrection was preached very early in Jerusalem. That's affirmed by everybody in this field. Number 8, the day of worship was moved to Sunday. Number 9, Paul, who wasn't one of the disciples, that's why it's different from 6, Paul radically converted from an experience that he believed to be an appearance of the risen Jesus. And then last, James also. Again, originally not a disciple, so he's separate. The brother of Jesus converted from doubt to belief in Jesus. Now, in Habermas's work, he has compiled a list of over 3,000 scholars over the last 50 years. English, German, and French scholars, Jewish scholars, atheist scholars, liberal, conservative Christian scholars, as many people as he could compile, right, who specialize, who have terminal degrees or academic positions in these specific fields. So a professional biologist wouldn't count, even though a professional biologist would be a scholar. He's not a scholar in this field. So Habermas would only count scholars, again, with terminal degrees and academic positions in the fields of history, New Testament studies, and such like that. The way that the minimal facts approach works is that after the minimal facts are laid out and a person gives reasons and evidence that why scholars affirm all these things, then the next step is to ask, well, what best explains all these facts? If all these facts are given or affirmed by everybody, then what best explains these facts? And the minimal facts approach then goes on to argue that Jesus' literal bodily resurrection is what best explains these facts. And it's compared and contrasted with alternative theories, and then shown that those other theories don't account for these facts, as well as Jesus' literal bodily resurrection. So I'm going to share a video with you now. It's, I think, 5 or 6 minute video, and it's William Lane Craig making a similar minimal facts approach argument. Okay, so take a look at this.
Why was Jesus of Nazareth crucified? Because he made outrageous claims about himself. He claimed to be the one and only Son of God. Why would anyone take his claim seriously? Well, that all depends. If Jesus actually rose from the dead, then his claim to be God's unique Son carries considerable weight. On the other hand, if the resurrection never actually happened, then Jesus may be safely dismissed as just another interesting but tragic historical figure. Did Jesus rise from the dead? As we explore this question, we need to address two further questions. What are the facts that require explanation? And which explanation best accounts for these facts? There are three main facts that need to be explained: the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus alive after his death, and the disciples' belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Let's examine each of these. Fact number one. The discovery that Jesus' tomb was empty is reported in no less than 6 independent sources, and some of these are among the earliest materials to be found in the New Testament. This is important because when an event is recorded by 2 or more unconnected sources, historians' confidence that the event actually happened increases, and the earlier these sources are dated, the higher their confidence. Moreover, the Gospels indicate that it was women who first discovered that Jesus' body was missing. This is likely historical because in that culture, a woman's testimony was considered next to worthless. A later legend or fabrication would have had men make this discovery. Our confidence in the empty tomb is further increased by the response of the Jewish authorities. When they heard the report that the tomb was found empty, they said that Jesus' followers had stolen his body, thereby admitting that Jesus' tomb was in fact empty. Most scholars by far hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. Fact number 2. The appearances of Jesus alive after his death. In one of the earliest letters in the New Testament, Paul provides a list of witnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Finally, he appeared also to me. Furthermore, various resurrection appearances of Jesus are independently confirmed by the Gospel accounts. On the basis of Paul's testimony alone, virtually all historical scholars agree that various individuals and groups experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Fact number 3. The disciples' belief in the resurrection. After Jesus' crucifixion, his followers were devastated, demoralized, and hiding in fear for their lives. As Jews, they had no concept of a Messiah who would be executed by his enemies, much less come back to life. The only resurrection Jews believed in was a universal event on Judgment Day after the end of the world, not an individual event within history. Moreover, in Jewish law, Jesus' crucifixion as a criminal meant that he was literally under God's curse. Yet somehow, despite all of this, the disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. They were so completely convinced that, when threatened with death, not one of them recanted. Even the Pharisee Paul, who persecuted Christians, suddenly became a Christian himself, as did Jesus' skeptical younger brother, James. Some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. These three firmly established facts cry out for an adequate explanation. How do you make sense of them? Down through history, various naturalistic explanations have been offered to explain away these facts. The conspiracy hypothesis, the apparent death hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and so on. All of these have been nearly universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there is just no plausible naturalistic explanation of these three facts. The explanation given by the original eyewitnesses is that God raised Jesus from the dead. If it's even possible that God exists, then that explanation cannot be ruled out. For a God who is able to create the entire universe, the odd resurrection would be child's play. An empty tomb, Jesus' appearances alive after his death, and a group of dejected followers suddenly transformed by a radical new belief in a risen Messiah. These are independently established historical facts. How do you explain them?
These are great videos to post on social media because they're relatively short and they're done really well, animation and all that. So, especially with Easter coming up. We didn't plan it this way, but it's neat that we're talking about this so close to Easter. But what I'm getting at is this might be a great time for you to post these videos on social media and share them and just see what kind of conversation comes about from it. Well, some of you might be aware that the minimal facts approach is a bit controversial, even among Christians. And so I want to give you guys a few minutes to discuss what you think about the minimal facts argument and strengths, weaknesses, your thoughts on it. So I'll give you guys a few minutes here to discuss at your tables. Okay, one of the things that you'll often hear minimal facts guys say, those who use the minimal facts approach, you'll often hear them say things like, look, you don't need the New Testament to be historically reliable, to show that the resurrection is true. We can show that the resurrection is true even if most of the New Testament is historically unreliable. And if the resurrection is true, then Christianity is true. At least mere Christianity would be true. Now, some Christians don't like the minimal facts approach because they think that it means you're admitting that the New Testament is mostly not historically reliable, or that the New Testament has historical mistakes. But that's not the case. As I'm saying, these proponents of the minimal facts argument, they do believe that the New Testament is historically reliable. It's kind of like, again, that attorney who thinks that DNA evidence is good, solid evidence, but just realizes that their primary audience doesn't buy that sort of DNA evidence, right? So the minimal facts approach, they're using this approach more as a strategic move. It's not as though they think the New Testament is mostly historically unreliable. It's that they know the audience that they're trying to reach thinks that. In other words, some non-Christians will argue like this. Some non-Christians will say, look, if we can demonstrate that most of the New Testament is historically unreliable, then we've proven Christianity is false. So you might have even, hear skeptics argue like that. They try to argue for premise one, that most in the New Testament is historically unreliable, and then conclude from that, if that's the case, that Christianity is false. But the minimal facts approach, guys, would say, well, is that necessarily the case? If most of the New Testament is historically unreliable, does that really prove that Christianity is false? Now, of course, if the New Testament is mostly historically reliable, then Christianity is true. But the minimal facts approach says, look, even if most of the New Testament is historically unreliable, this still wouldn't prove that Christianity is false. Now, this is a pretty powerful move to make in a debate, right? I mean, first, you can argue against this premise, and I think that would be a wise thing to do. It's kind of what we've been doing this whole year, right? We've been trying to make the case that the New Testament is historically reliable. So we've been pushing back against this premise, right? But a strategic move in a debate or a conversation would be to say, look, even if your premise is correct, your conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. That's a very powerful strategic move to make in a debate, is to grant the premise and show that the conclusion doesn't follow. Now, I'm wording this very carefully, and I'm trying to make sure that I'm saying it carefully as well. I'm saying most of the New Testament is historically unreliable. Obviously, if all of the New Testament was historically unreliable, then that would prove Christianity is false. But as we've seen from Ehrman and other non-Christian scholars, nobody believes that all of the New Testament is historically unreliable. Virtually everybody agrees that at least some of it is historically reliable. And that is what the minimal facts approach is making use of. Those particular sections of the New Testament that everybody affirms are historically reliable. So, of course, this approach is using material from the New Testament, right? It's not getting away from primarily using the New Testament as the source of evidence, but only those sections of the New Testament that even critical scholars agree is historically reliable. So you might take even maybe the most liberal or skeptical group of scholars. They're known as the Jesus Seminar. And so if they lay out, kind of like we've done before, you lay out all of the things that the New Testament says about Jesus. As they've done that verse by verse, I think the most skeptical group, the Jesus Seminar, says that about 15% of the New Testament has the highest degree of historical reliability, right? So even the most skeptical group is going to say some portions of the New Testament are very historically reliable. They wouldn't reject 85% of it as unreliable. They would just say there's not as much evidence for the other 85%. Only 15% rise to this level that we're also saying about these minimal facts. Okay? Like I said, it's kind of like that list of all the information that's said about Jesus in the New Testament, right? We've kind of developed this hypothetical. This is what it would look like if we went on all the sources, 20 plus sources, and then all of the hundreds and hundreds of information about Jesus in the New Testament. And you could start laying out, right, what facts about Jesus have the most independent, early eyewitness sources that affirm that. And we've used the example many times. There's only one source that says he has sisters, so we're not nearly as confident about that as we are, for example, that he had brothers, because there's just more sources that say that. So with this approach, one of the strengths of this approach is that it doesn't get sidetracked by, I guess you could say, more trivial questions. For example, sometimes when you're having to make a case that the New Testament is historically reliable, you get caught up in the weeds. Things like, well, who wrote the book of Hebrews? We're not quite sure, right? Then you go down that path for a while. Or when exactly was the Gospel of John written? What about the contradictions between the Gospels, right? If you're taking the approach of trying to make a case that the New Testament is historically reliable, you can get caught up in some of these sidetracked issues, some of these more minutia type issues. And the minimal facts approach just sidesteps all of those and says, look, you don't think that the Gospel of John is historically reliable? Fine, I won't use it for this argument. We don't know who the author of Hebrews is? Fine, we won't use Hebrews for this argument. So it just focuses on the resurrection. Some might say, well, why not use all the evidence? Why not use all the evidence that we have at our disposal? Why just use the minimal facts? Well, that's what we usually do in an argument, right? Is we present the strongest facts. So if you're an attorney arguing a case in front of a jury, you might not give them all the 1,000 facts that you have. You might just focus on the 10 strongest facts that you have that prove your point, right? So that might be a reason why the minimal facts approach just focuses on the best evidence instead of all of the evidence we might have. All right, obviously the power of this approach then is that you don't have to establish the historical reliability of the New Testament first. You can just focus on the main issue. Did Jesus rise from the dead or not? It's kind of like investigating whether or not the Titanic sunk, right? There's debate about those details from different eyewitnesses, right? So there's debate, scholars debate whether the Titanic sunk in one piece or if it broke in two pieces and sunk separately, right? But you could say, look, let's not get distracted by these details. We all agree that it sunk, and that's the primary issue. So it's similar with the resurrection, right? We don't want to get caught up necessarily in all these sidetrack details and just focus on, is there good historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead or not? Now, some people don't like the minimal facts argument because they think it's hard to show that all scholars agree on certain facts, right? But it's common for historians to do that, to list out several facts which they claim all scholars agree to. I mean, we saw Ehrman do it, right? Ehrman actually laid out 10 facts as well, in which he said all scholars affirm these things with a high degree of certainty. And there's a bit of overlap between this list and Habermas's list. So this isn't an uncommon thing that scholars do. I mean, this is done in the sciences. This is done in all fields. And if you work in a field for 40 years, like Ehrman and Habermas and some of these other scholars have, I think it's safe to say, look, I've been in this field. I know the vast majority of how scholars in this field think. And you can say things like that. Yeah, virtually all scholars. So when Ehrman says these things, or when Habermas says these things, I think they're in a legitimate place to say that. It'd be kind of like a biologist saying, look, all professional biologists who have terminal degrees in biology and have an academic position in the biological sciences at universities affirm that evolution is true. I don't need a list of all of those biologists. We know that. We just know the vast majority of biologists affirm evolution. Similarly, as we've talked before, I think you could safely say all dentists encourage people to brush their teeth. I'm sure there's some outlandish dentist somewhere who has another method of cleaning, right, than brushing your teeth. But the vast majority of dentists, I think we could safely say, encourage us to brush our teeth. So I don't think it's outrageous for Habermas or Ehrman to say these things. Now, some people don't like the minimal facts argument because it bases conclusions on what the experts say. And the pushback is, well, experts can be wrong. And of course experts can be wrong. And it's not really, as Ehrman pointed out, it's not really that the experts say it which give us a high degree of certainty, but the fact that virtually all scholars affirm certain facts implies that there is a tremendous amount of strong evidence for them. Otherwise, all the scholars would not agree on it, right? So we're not necessarily basing it on the position of experts. We're basing it on the evidence which has led all experts to these conclusions. Okay, just to kind of explain a little bit the difference just so you can get it. Sometimes I think of it in terms of an umbrella approach versus a sniper approach. So if you take the umbrella approach, right, you're making the case that the New Testament, for the most part, is historically reliable. And then, everything that the New Testament discusses, we can say is historically true, right? So you're kind of building this umbrella. The entire New Testament's historically reliable, and then everything it says can be trusted. With the minimal facts approach, it's more like a sniper approach, where we're just focusing in on the resurrection. So I want to give you some time now, again, to discuss at your table, what approach do you prefer and why? So go ahead and discuss at your table for a few minutes here. Okay. I think as you guys have correctly discussed at your table, there certainly are pros and cons for each approach, right? I don't know if I would have a preference per se. I think it's a strong move, and I'll go back here real quickly. As a philosopher, I think it's a strong move to do both. To first, and we kind of did this with evolution, if you remember last year, right? We asked the question, if evolution was true, would that prove that Christianity is false? And we said, well, if evolution is false, certainly that wouldn't prove that Christianity is false. And we made our best case, that evolution is false. But then we also discussed the second option. What if evolution is true? If evolution is true, would that prove that Christianity is false? And then we made that case that no, even if evolution is true, that wouldn't prove Christianity is false. And I think a similar move can be made here, using both approaches together, in a sense, where you're pushing back against the first premise. And I think, we spent a lot of our time this year making that case, that most of the New Testament's historically reliable. I don't think even we would want to argue that all of it is either, because for example, his sisters. We've only got one source that says that. Can you say then that how much certainty or how much confidence do we have that he had sisters? Well, when we have one source, you just can't be as confident as you are about other things that have more early independent sources, right? So we can make the case that most of the New Testament is historically reliable, especially the main issues that we're trying to tackle, his miracles, that we have good early eyewitness sources for. But even if we're wrong, let's say, even if we're wrong about that, and most of the New Testament is historically unreliable, the conclusion doesn't follow. And then you can use the minimal facts approach. So I look at it as more of a 1-2 punch, that they can be used together. So a lot of the debate among Christians is what to start with. A lot of the debate among Christians it's kind of like when it comes to apologetic method, where do you begin in the process? So sometimes the debate between those who are for minimal facts and those who are against minimal facts approach has gotten a little heated. Those two groups have kind of gone after each other a little bit more aggressively than they probably should have. But I think it's a good thing to discuss and think through. What are the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches? Okay, well, as I said, the way that it works, the next step then with the minimal facts approach is to consider other naturalistic explanations then, and to show that those explanations just don't fit the minimal facts as well. Okay? So the idea that Jesus fainted, he didn't really die, he just swooned on the cross. The idea that the disciples stole the body, let's say. You go through all these various alternatives and show that the minimal facts are best explained by the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus. And these other naturalistic explanations don't cover the minimal facts as well. As we've discussed many times this year, it's very easy to come up with the possibility, right? I mean, we could do this all night. Come up with, well, is it possible, right, that the disciples stole the body, or that Joseph of Arimathea stole the body or hid the body somewhere else? Of course it's possible, but you've got to do more than just present a possibility. You've got to give evidence. We wouldn't be able just to throw out the possibility that Jesus rose from the dead. No, we need to provide evidence for that. And we've tried to do that by giving, early multiple sources that say they saw the risen Jesus. So you can't just come up with a possibility. You've got to have sources. You've got to have evidence for it. So let's just go through some of these alternatives, okay? So first alternative, we'll cover that the disciples stole Jesus' body while the guards slept. This is the oldest theory, right? This is even from what we can see in the New Testament, what the Jewish leaders claimed happened, right? So there's a sense we have enemy attestation that the tomb was empty, if that part of the New Testament is historically reliable, of course. In other words, the enemies of the disciples, the enemy of the early Christians, didn't deny the evidence. They didn't deny that there was an empty tomb, but they offered a natural explanation for it, that the disciples stole the body. But that would be difficult, and this is why scholars have mostly rejected this alternative. That would be difficult for several reasons, right? The tomb was guarded. The chief priests paid the guards to say that the disciples stole it while they were sleeping, which is unlikely because the guards would be killed for falling asleep on the job like that. Plus, if they were sleeping, how would they know that the disciples stole the body, right? If they were asleep. Plus, it just doesn't fit the facts, right? It doesn't explain the appearances that the disciples had. It doesn't explain these transformed lives, such that they were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs. Because if they stole the body, right, they were lying about it. And as we've discussed, liars don't make very good martyrs. If they were in the best position to know whether it was true or false, they would not be willing to die for what they knew was false. All right, and it doesn't explain these transformations either, Paul and James. So what about the wrong tomb theory? That the women and then ultimately the disciples accidentally went to the wrong tomb. They found it empty and mistakenly concluded that Jesus was resurrected. Well, if this is what happened, first of all, why would the Jewish leaders then claim that the body was stolen? Why would they come up with some sort of alternative explanation if it was just the wrong tomb? Plus, it doesn't fit these facts, right? The appearances. And this is why this fifth minimal fact is so key, because these experiences, and again, this is why virtually all scholars affirm that the disciples believed Jesus really rose from the dead. What about this one? This one isn't nearly as popular as it used to be, but in the 1800s, kind of in the heyday of this movement of coming up with these alternative naturalistic explanations, this was popular in the 1800s. The idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but only fainted or swooned. It's even an old word that we don't use anymore. I mean, when's the last time you said swoon? Maybe when you were dating and you swooned in the arms of your boyfriend or girlfriend. But we just don't use that term. It shows you how old of a theory this is from the 1800s. But nobody really holds it anymore, and I think you'll see why. It's unlikely that someone could survive crucifixion. It was a completely brutal experience. It was a soldier's job. They were professional executioners. They knew how to make sure somebody was dead. 3 medical doctors, one a pathologist from Mayo Clinic, evaluated the evidence and concluded that Jesus must have died on the cross. They actually published their findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association. I'll read just a paragraph from that. They wrote, "Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted and supports the traditional view that the spear, thrust between his right ribs, probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured death. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge." Plus, a bloodied, half-dead Jesus limping around is probably not going to inspire his disciples to think that he rose from the dead and was now the Lord of life, transforming them into the bold martyrs that they became. So these are the facts that the swoon theory conflicts with, right? And again, all scholars nowadays affirm that Jesus, in fact, died by crucifixion. That's one of the most multiple attested facts we have about Jesus. We just have that from so many sources, both within and outside the New Testament. That's probably why it's the number one fact, that Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. And it doesn't explain the appearances again, like most of them don't. So now we'll move on to an interesting one that's still often brought up from time to time, the hallucination theory. And if that picture doesn't cause you to hallucinate, then I don't know what will. Maybe drugs. But I'll let you chew on it. I'll give you one more time to interact at your table with your group and discuss this hallucination theory. That, again, the disciples didn't, they had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus, but it wasn't actually, they were just hallucinating those things. So that would explain why they believed it was true, but it was just a hallucination. So talk about that at your table, see if maybe there's minimal facts that it doesn't account for, and maybe how you would respond to somebody who was proposing the hallucination alternative. I'll give you a few minutes to discuss. Okay. Well, let's see how the minimal facts guys usually respond to the hallucination theory. Okay? The usual pushback against this theory is, look, hallucinations don't happen to groups. Hallucinations are, as far as we know, only individual experiences. They're like dreams. People don't share dreams, unless you're in Inception, I guess, right? Christopher Nolan's Inception movie. But in real life, people don't share dreams, nor do they share hallucinations. These take place at an individual level. But the critic may say, look, resurrections don't happen either. But yet you're claiming Jesus rose from the dead. Well, we agree, right? Resurrections don't happen naturally. So if we were putting forth Jesus' resurrection as a natural explanation, that would be shut down, right? Because it's true, resurrections don't happen naturally. And we're saying the same thing about hallucinations. Hallucinations don't happen in a group naturally, right? That's why the group hallucination theory doesn't work as a natural explanation. Just like the resurrection wouldn't work as a natural explanation. Bodies don't rise from the dead naturally, and naturally groups don't have hallucinations together. The difference is we're proposing that the resurrection took place supernaturally, that God, who exists outside of nature, caused the resurrection, right? So I would be open to a supernatural hallucination, right? A supernatural group hallucination. It doesn't work at the natural level, but I could see where if there is a God who exists outside of nature, could cause a group hallucination to happen or a bodily resurrection to happen, right? So as supernatural explanations, both of those are viable. The thing is, what is there better evidence for? Is there better evidence for a supernatural group hallucination or better evidence for a supernatural resurrection? And I think based on the minimal facts approach, we can make a case that there's stronger evidence for a supernatural bodily resurrection. So if you take this hallucination theory and run it through the minimal facts, right? It wouldn't be able to explain the empty tomb. So oftentimes the hallucination theory is paired with another theory, which starts to feel a bit ad hoc. Plus, it doesn't explain Paul and James, because these folks would be unlikely. Usually the story goes that the reason the disciples hallucinated is because they were in such despair, which everybody agrees to, right? And yes, being in despair does make you more prone to hallucination, but that wouldn't explain these guys because they weren't in despair, right? They weren't disciples of Jesus. All right, let's move on just a couple more. We're about out of time. The substitute theory, right? Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. It was a substitute. And one theory says that it was only Jesus and his substitute that knew about it. Another theory says, no, all the disciples were in on it. But either way, it doesn't fit the facts, right? So if it was just Jesus and his substitute who was in on it, then it wouldn't explain this, right? And if the disciples were in on it, it wouldn't be able to explain these other minimal facts as well. All right, a popular one, at the popular level, I should say, is this idea that Jesus' resurrection was just an invented story copied from ancient pagan myths, right? That there's these myths which inspired them to come up with this mythical account of Jesus as well, that it was based on these ancient myths. And they've even seen probably at the popular level where folks try to make all these comparisons and similarities between these mythical stories and Jesus. So this is definitely not the case anymore at the academic level, as we've seen even Ehrman discuss this. Well, first of all, we can say it doesn't deal with these facts, right? But then, as we've discussed already, Ehrman has shown us that scholarship has completely moved on from this theory. That scholars just don't even really discuss this theory anymore. This was a very popular theory, especially again in the 1800s during the height of all of these alternative naturalistic theories being proposed. It was very, very popular. And sometimes you'll still hear it at the popular level. But as we've seen Ehrman make the case that scholars don't even consider this anymore. Even if there was, which there's not good evidence that there was, these ancient myths that have similarities to Jesus' resurrection story, but even if there was, as Ehrman says, it stretches credulity to think such a mythology, if it even did exist, which there's not much evidence it did, played any role in the world of Jesus' earliest Jewish followers.